There we are. All right. Welcome everyone to the 29th virtual roundtable on measuring corruption. It's very good to see a lot of familiar faces. Many of you have been with us. A few of you have presented also in the past. Katerina, how are you? Very nice having you with us today. And others as well are joining us for the first time, so I welcome you too. I will be your host for the next 90 minutes. I am Joseph Pochgay Alvarez, associate professor at Osaka University, and today we have a wonderful presentation about the OECD, or very much based on the OECD Public Integrity Indicators. Although Jesper Johnsøn, who will be presenting today with Oksana Huss, he has presented already on the Public Integrity Indicators. I believe it was last year. But today, of course, we have a different presentation because there has been a recent update with new data coming out, and specifically, I reached out to him and his team to see about having a presentation on political accountability. So the data that we'll be focused on today is related to that. So I'm very excited about this. It's a topic that I wanted to host in this series for a really long time. And of course, I couldn't think of a better team and a better person to present in this than Jesper and his team at the OECD. So before I invite him to introduce his team and his work, I would like to just go very quickly through some basic description of how the roundtable will take place over the next 90 minutes. So we'll have about, in terms of content of presentation, about 40 minutes, 45 minutes. In the original call, it was described as being followed by another 45 minutes of Q&A and comments, although it had become habitual for us to have it actually comments and questions taking place during that presentation. And please, Jesper, if this is still okay. All right, great. So this means that if you have any burning questions or you know, the presentation on any given slide give you an idea or some thought that you would like to share, you don't have to wait until the very end, although you can if you wish to. But otherwise, you can just raise your hand on the video or click the icon of raising your hand, and I will invite to unmute yourself and participate actively. Otherwise, I ask you to please remain muted throughout the presentation. And if you need to leave the room and come back, to make sure that when you come back that the microphone is also muted. All right? Yes, so you won't be hearing much from me other than this, except when I have any questions or comments for the presenters. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So it's my pleasure to invite Jesper and Oksana and the rest of the team to you know, take charge now. And you please you can feel free to start sharing your screen whenever you're ready.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I guess it's always a good indication to be invited back. This time, trying to go a bit deeper was the instructions and broaden out, kind of let you look a little bit behind the kitchen, I think was the formulation, to understand how some of the indicators are calculated, showing the different methods that we use. And then, of course, focusing a bit more in terms of thematic focus on what we call political accountability, political integrity. For us, it's a particular principle within our recommendation, Principle 13. It's called accountability of public policymaking in our data set. So yeah, very happy to be here, and it's nice to have a chance to have like a real dialogue and not one of the massive big plenary sessions where it's a one-way communication. So I'm very happy to, let's just say, whenever you have a question, you raise your hand virtually, and then we pause and we take our time to explain. Some of it is not easy, so it's perfectly fine to hit the pause button. So I'm here with Oksana, of course. I think many of you know Oksana, but do you want to introduce yourself anyway?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I know there are many familiar names and faces, but I don't know everyone. I joined OECD recently, so I'm quite new also to the indicators exercise. But I used to work in academia and co-founded Interdisciplinary Corruption Research Network, where I also know Joseph from. And usually my role was on the other side, translating research into practice, but now I'm kind of flipping the side and will try to translate all this process into research language. So let's see how it works. But as I say, I'm learning more than kind of giving input now.
You started in January, right?
In February.
February, okay. So it's fairly new, but you are applying the indicators in the Ukraine review we're doing. So this is how you're getting familiar with this, and it's a good example of how we're using the indicators for various measures. But Cameron has been here longer. He's part of the set of the group of analysts who are really behind the scenes. So he's the perfect person to answer the, in the kitchen questions of how do we actually in practice analyze legislation, analyze government reports, the administrative data that we use, how do we analyze all of that and validate that with governments. So should we just go ahead? We have a quick presentation for you. Some of it will be a little familiar with what we did last time, but most of it will be new. So I was also suggested or instructed to give a bit of a broader perspective so that people know where we are in terms of the OECD. And when we get to talk about political integrity or political accountability, it's nice to not just talk about the measurement angle, but what the constructs, what are we trying to measure and where do these ideas or concepts come from? So I think for us, for I think most international organizations, it all starts with the standards that are adopted by member countries. And I think the ones that I show here on the screen are, let's say, those that are within the remit of the Public Governance Directorate where we work. So we work in the Anti-Corruption in Government division within the Public Governance Directorate. And these are the three of our main standards that we have worked, that as a secretariat, we've worked with member countries to formulate, and member countries have signed up to and agreed to through the OECD Council, the highest level decision-making body. So these are standards that countries embrace. The most recent one, which the indicators are structured around, is the recommendation on public integrity. I included also the 2003 recommendation on conflict of interest because it shows quite well the trajectory of how increasingly within the OECD we've expanded the scope and the conceptual space of what does corruption mean, and moving into the more political, moving beyond. So the 2003 recommendation was about the public service, so civil servants within the public service, and how do we have a good conflict of interest regime for civil servants. If we move to the 2017 latest recommendation, you will see that a public official, the definition of that is much wider, and it is not just a civil servant, it's also politically appointed officials, it's members of government, so ministers, it's members of parliament, MPs. Because of the realization that many of the really egregious cases of corruption, many of the really high corruption risk areas are not only in the civil service, but are in this space that we can call political integrity or political accountability. Another very good illustration of that is the new lobbying recommendation that we just adopted through the Ministerial Council a few weeks ago. So this was an update of the previous recommendation. The previous recommendation focused on the formal policymaking processes, and the need for a revision of that recommendation And everything is members driven at the OECD. So you have to convince governments that this is a good idea, and the governments have to sign off on it. And the rationale for doing that was to show evidence that the formal policymaking process, by now we have the standards, we have the advice in terms of what are the main corruption risks. There is still an implementation gap. We can get back to that. This is what the outlook, the Anti-Corruption and Integrity Outlook documents. What is the implementation gap in terms of countries implementing these standards? But at the normative level, we have good advice on what are good integrity safeguards for lobbying and influence through this formal policymaking process, where you prepare a law, you send it to regulatory impact assessment, you prepare the law to go to parliament, you have different parliamentary committees debating, and realizing that probably the most, again, egregious forms of corruption and worst types of influence against the public interest will happen either in the prior stages to that, before the policies are even put on the agenda, or in the later stages when policies, primary legislation actually has to be formulated into secondary legislation, where again, you can have much more, if you're a lobbyist and you want to influence your case in your favor, that's probably where it makes most sense to start, because the attention space is much less and there are no regulations, and you can much more under the veil operate here. So that was the ambition of the 2024 update of the lobbying recommendation, is to broaden that space of what do we mean by lobbying, what do we even mean by going beyond the term lobbying and talk about influence. Yes. So, and maybe just to give you even bigger perspective. So this is, I think, where the Public Governance Directorate has moved into this political space, political integrity, and it aligns very well with our focus, also recent focus on reinforcing democracy, on talking about democracy as a positive value. When I started the OECD 10 years ago, we would be a bit more technocratic in the way that we talking about public administration reform, talking about civil service bureaucracy, whereas this is a real big new work stream that we have. It's very related to our trust work, where we go and measure the levels of trust in OECD countries. So it's part of this bigger package. And maybe, again, just to give you the big overview of the OECD, we have other standards on state-owned enterprises, for example, which is in another directorate, in the business directorate. We have other standards on bribery, foreign bribery for international business transactions, and the transnational elements of corruption. So again, we are not covering that in our indicators. So transnational corruption is not part of the indicator framework. Foreign bribery is not part of the indicator framework. State-owned enterprises is not part of the indicator framework. But everything that is in these standards that we have here is very much something that we focus on. That was already very long, but it's probably a nice kind of context for you all when Oksana gets going later on. And then we have various policy fora where we discuss. The most important one is the Working Party on Public Integrity and Anti-Corruption. We just renamed it. It used to be called SPIO or SPIO, so Senior Public Integrity Officials. Now it's called the Working Party on Public Integrity and Anti-Corruption, to emphasize that now we do much more of the classic, not just the prevention and prevention side and the integrity side, but also more classic anti-corruption work. We have various expert networks for auditors, for example, Auditors Alliance, central network for central harmonization functions, network for lobbying commissions. If you, for example, look at the agenda of the Global Anti-Corruption and Integrity Forum, you will see these different expert networks that we meet once a year in Paris, and various regional networks. I think a big part of coming back to this community here is that now we've had the public integrity indicator as a new standard within the OECD for measuring anti-corruption, resilience to corruption for 3-4 years now, and we've had the data set, and we could speak to to the nerds in this room that would hopefully take up the data and do something amazing with that. But now, finally, we also have our own outlet, our own cross-country publication, which is the Outlook. So the Outlook is mainly based on the data from the Public Integrity Indicators, with also a forward-looking section that tries to look at the main kind of trends and threats to the future, where we focused on AI, green, what's the third? Foreign influence. So if you haven't looked at the Outlook yet, I would urge you to do so. But of course, it's just a very small selection of the whole data set. And we will show you some additional data that might feature in the next Outlook. It's scheduled to be coming out every 2 years. Okay, so maybe moving on to the next slide. This one I did last time, so I'll do it very quickly. So why did we develop a new standard set of indicators? So again, it was to have more reliable evidence, not just rely on, say, expert proxies, not just rely on perception data, which is very, very useful, but never tells the full truth. I think no data set ever tells the full truth. So it's good to come with a set of more objective indicators that is based on, also in this circle, that is actually based on validated data directly from governments. Most data that we can use in this area is either secondary data sources, where the ultimate origin of the data is either a private sector risk rating agency, or an expert rating, or a perception based data. We wanted to do a dashboard, not a ranking. So again, it makes it a bit more difficult to navigate the data. So you will not find country X is more corrupt than country Y. This is not the purpose of these indicators. Rather, they're really meant to be useful for countries in improving specific subsystems. And that could be, again, around the lobbying systems, or the political finance system, or the conflict of interest system, or the internal audit system. So you have to dig down into these specific areas where you have professional communities that know what they're talking about, and where we know the standards and we know what needs to be done in terms of implementation. We're, of course, very focused on serving governments. So that's our primary objective. We have a task force, which is a subset of the full working party, which was very closely engaged when we developed the indicators. So we used them as a sparring partner to go as far as we could and kind of push the boundaries, but also keep it realistic in terms of, can we actually get that data? Is this an international norm that's established already? But I think as we grow, we will be a bit more outward facing also. The Outlook is one important part of that, to have that actual publication. But we are also, I've been talking about it for a long time, but we're definitely going ahead now and launching a research challenge, so that we will have a little competition where countries can, where academics and think tanks and other experts can hopefully unpack also the data and see what interesting lessons learned there is in this data set. And I think that another final thing that's very important is this thing about improving the data quality, improving the data availability at the OECD membership. So we try to find most of the indicators, particularly the numerical rates. We'll get back to the different types of indicators. They're actually based on real life examples that we then take from 1 or 2 countries that are at the forefront. And we try to spread these KPIs to the full membership. Again, trying to not to reinvent the wheel and being too, sorry about, again, the setting of being too academic, but being very pragmatic and being very kind of focused on things that already work. But what the OECD can do is to scale that up. And I think a big byproduct of this whole exercise is that we will see But governments hopefully will get better data, and that will also benefit civil society and academia in the long term. Okay, so next slide.
Jesper, may I interrupt with
Yes.
a question?
Oh.
Thank you.
Yep.
Because I find it so insightful and really informative having your, let's say, a recount of the experience within the OECD in going through this process, and being able to talk to you that has so many years already within the institution, and of course you were there from the before the inception of the public integrity indicators themselves. I'm very curious about the process of translating the text of the standards to actual indicators, because of course that the process of operationalizing ideas that, even though are clear ideas, there's always an element of vagueness that remains in the text, right? In terms of, for example, the usage of some adjectives such as going beyond minimum requirements or establishing appropriate mechanisms. I wonder how the OECD or your team, if your team managed this process, how was this translated into the indicators? And I was also wondering if state parties participated in this process.
Yeah, it's a very good question. State parties do participate. So right now we're putting the last touches on the fourth data set, which is the justice indicators. So integrity in the judiciary. It's a good illustration of now how we work. So everything has to, let's say, be anchored in the recommendation. But in this case, we also have various other recommendations. We have, OECD is not the only standard setter here, obviously. There's many international organizations, Council of Europe, etc., that have very important standards. So we make sure not just our own recommendation, but other international organizations that we are aligned with the international norms that are there. But even within the OECD, various different divisions, various different directorates have various legal instruments on the judiciary. So that's just kind of the nuts and bolts of what it means, what my work is to scan that big landscape of the different standards and kind of have the, as you say, then how do we translate that not into another normative sentence, because there's plenty of that, but into actual set of, so in our world of the indicators, it has to be a very clear checklist with very binary statements or very binary kind of criteria for, let's say, independence, for these kind of broader abstract concepts of independence, of it was just yesterday we had the conversation.
Independence, accountability, transparency.
Yeah. So, and then whistleblowing, for example, whistleblowing systems in the judiciary, and how do we actually go down? So that is a bit of that is the craft, right? That is the of trying to make it as precise as possible, as measurable. Through the years, you figure out that you shouldn't put too many things into a single criteria, because then countries will be very upset and academics will be very upset. You don't know what they fulfill out of that long sentence. So you have to really break it down into the constituent components of what this is. So it's both fair and transparent and measurable. So that's one thing, is just to kind of take each concept, and actually Oksana will talk about that later, so I shouldn't talk too much. Take each concept, break it down into, and here, honestly, people have different philosophies. Some people like measurement, some people don't like measurement. For some people, an indicator is always too crude a construct of reality, and they would prefer not to do it. They would prefer never to go into this space because they do too much harm than good. And I think that is the real difficult line. When are we doing more good than harm? Because definitely always we will never fully capture the reality of this grand statement of judicial independence. It means so many things in so many different contexts. And we have to make it work across different types of legal systems, different geographies, where you have various different understandings of this. Practically, I think a good way to work for us is always to, whenever we come up with a first draft, I always want to see that, okay, but can you give me examples from different countries across the world of where this works? So I will ask Cameron to check for the US, I will ask Oksana to check for Ukraine, and just to kind of root it in reality and to say, okay. And then we do have cases where we have criteria which very few countries fulfill, but we stand by them because normatively they are very important. So for example, on lobbying, I think very few countries fulfill the stipulation that lobbyists entering government should also submit an interest declaration. But it didn't hold us back. We still included it in the framework, but it's always nice to include it on the basis of knowing the empirical data, and that sharpens the indicators. So that's a long process, really working hard through it. And then countries are included in this process, and they're so we always ask countries to nominate experts. So in this case, they nominate from the Ministries of Justice. And they are our best clients here because they will scrutinize. They will say, in this case, you are definitely, there is no international legal instrument that says that. You are being too hard, you're being too, it's going to be too much work for us to collect the data. So we go through these processes, and that's part of the fine tuning with the countries. I think one main difference is that where, let's say, the ambassadors, they sign off on the recommendation itself, on the legal instrument. For the indicator framework, it's going through the working parties, so it's not at the highest level. So there's a different level of adoption, which is quite normal. That the more technical papers, like the indicators, they don't go to the highest political levels. But it's like normal legislation in a national setting. You have primary legislation, secondary legislation, and the indicators is a bit like secondary legislation. We have to stay within the primary legislation and be true to that, but we also need a bit of space to make good indicators. Okay.
Right. No, that's very interesting. So if you would allow me to just follow up on that point, because I'm also curious, and please correct me if I'm overthinking this, because as I understand it, then there's a process, especially as you also consider other standards or recommendations that align with the recommendation from the OECD, but coming from other organizations or reputable international organizations. You end up in the process of developing the indicators and collecting the data, fleshing out the recommendations themselves, right? Fleshing them out because, as you mentioned, at the end of the day, your task is to make measurement instruments, right, that can be employed. Of course, in the process, then we collect data, or your team collects the data, and the data reflects, or it tries to reflect or capture reality, right? When it comes to the interpretation of the meaning of those numbers, or the interpretation of what indicators are actually measuring from the side of your partners from these state parties that have participated in the process, do you find that they also develop certain degree of ownership of the indicators themselves? Are they fully aware, and do they understand, based on the indicators, what are the tasks for them? Because as you mentioned, the whole idea is to support governments to develop better policies, right? But as the indicators are fleshing out those recommendations, I'm wondering if from the side of the states themselves, they are capable, are they sufficient?
They know very well. They know every single criterion, and they insist on going through them before release. So the good thing we did in the very first edition of all the indicators, that we agreed with the countries before we started data collection. to make it that no one would only look at their own country, but that's the aim of the task force also, is that you leave your country hat aside a bit. You agree that these are good criteria, and then afterwards we go out, and then you can react from a national point of view, but it's still the common good that's the main perspective from the task force. Now what we're getting are these individual country reactions where we say, oh, my system is very different. My system is special. We need to have a not applicable status. So all of that is for us, the Secretariat, to explain why, okay, well, and these are the, let's say, we want to be very transparent with all of our methodology, and we can do a lot more. Part of today is also to show you a bit more in terms of our methodology. But also, there is always going to be, in any work, including the work that you do, there's always going to be the iceberg, that's the part of the iceberg that's underneath the water, where, let's say, Cameron will talk a lot to colleagues about how do we deal with presidential systems in this particular setting? How do we deal with common law countries? How do we deal with, there's so much where this inter-observer consistency is really important. And that relates to other international organizations as well. One of the things I was very happy, for example, with the Council of Europe, is that even though, so we also did expert consultations at the very early stages, and both academics and other international experts from international organizations were invited. And one of the things they said was exactly what you said before, is that it was very much aligned with their standards, and they actually saw it as very useful for their reports to have a kind of behind the scenes checklist to ensure this inter-observer consistency. So a lot of the hard work we did is also useful, I think, beyond just our team to flesh out like the basics. The basics of access to information, political finance, lobbying, which is probably the hardest things to do, Sometimes in life, the simple things are the hardest.
Very true. Thank you. I see that Kamel has raised his hand. Kamel,
yeah,
please
thank
go
you.
ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for your insightful thoughts. I wanted just to ask a question about data. You know that in measurement, data is the raw materials, and it's the most crucial segment in measurement. So how do you ensure the reliability of data? And do you have some mechanism to check the data that are provided by each government? And how do you address the gap between the existence of measure and the effectiveness of measure? Because I know the peer review of the UNODC, they measure the existence of the laws of the measure, but they don't go beyond that to check whether it's effective or not effective, because you can have a law about whistleblowing, but with no efficiency, with no effectiveness on the ground. So how do you to ensure the reliability of these two issues? The data, do you check the data? Because the government, if you leave all this to the government, they may, perhaps there is a bias always providing data, they can give things which are not really accurate. And the second is the gap between the existence of something and the effectiveness of that thing. Thank you.
Yeah, perfect question. It's actually the next slide, and it's a lot what Oksana will talk about, and a lot what Cameron will talk about. So Oksana will talk about the result chain and how the indicators follow a path from input to output to outcome, in some cases even impact, that we try to cover that full result chain as well as you can. In different areas, it's easier than others. In some areas we can combine all types of data. We can combine legislation with practice, with perceptions. In other areas, we don't have perception data, so we cannot triangulate everything. But we always split between de jure and de facto indicators. Not one-to-one, because sometimes it's impossible to check de facto, but where we can, we always go and check. And in many cases, and you can see that these are individual blocks, individual components of each of the indicators, so it's very clear. And this is why we're now able in the outlook to show the implementation gap. So we basically count how strong is the legislation. Okay, but how well implemented and how strong are the practices? And then admittedly, this very crude percentage is what we define as the implementation gap. So on the one hand, you have very strong legislation, and on the other hand, you could do better on practice. And Cameron is the best person to show you how we actually go and validate all of this data in practice. This is the part I'm probably most proud of, because a lot of the data out there that is freely accessible from 192 countries is admittedly not always very correct. For two reasons. One, because no one has ever checked it, even within the team of researchers. And two, because no one has ever sent it for validation with the owners of that data. So in this case, mostly the governments. And you need to do both to have reliable estimates. So Cameron will show how we do that in our team. And this is really, like, we actually do it, but I will let Cameron show that to you when we move ahead. So let's move a bit faster. This is just to say that today we are focused on the data set that is from 2022, the baseline. We'll do an update next year for the next outlook. But we also have other data sets on risks, on strategy, and the new ones that we're working on, as I said, is the justice indicators, and we will also work on external oversight, so Supreme Audit Institutions, Ombudsperson. But let's move a bit faster. This is a bit about our process. It gets a bit still too general, but I will let Oksana take over, and then after that is the actual slide where we can explain that. But a bit of theory first.
Yeah, so basically this is Joseph's question about the personalization, where it comes from. I would like to reflect on that. This is exactly this translation part, I will call. So in the basis, we always think about the purpose. So why do we measure? And there are different approaches, analytical approaches. So if you think of perception indicators or CPI, the purpose of it is rather to raise awareness, political awareness. Or do we measure corruption or try to detect corruption? This is a different approach. So the approach of these indicators, this is to set the norm and to incentivize. So going into practice. So from this purpose, it moves forward then, and it influences the whole process of what we are looking at and what we are measuring in the end. And the step two, then what is the concept? So are we looking at corruption or anti-corruption? And in public integrity indicators, we are talking about the integrity system. So what is here the difference? So one approach would be a different one to look at the agency, at the individual behavior, like TI does, measures experience of corruption. So this is a very kind of agency-based approach. Then we can look at the institutions, the frameworks. There was Camille's question, right? So where is the difference between the practice and the rules? But when we look at the system, we are looking at the processes and also practices. We are looking not only at the system, but integrity system, which means not like anti-corruption, what not to do, but also what to do. And the element that we are discussing today is this accountability in the policy making. This is only one principle of 13 that we have in the recommendation, integrity in the recommendation of 2017. And the last one, but it unpacks and unfolds a lot of different sub elements, so to say. And if we go to unpack it, this accountability in policymaking, and in the principle, in this document itself, you will have like 5 sentences. That's just what you said, right? So what do you do out of it? And the next step to look then into processes. And you will see that when we speak about accountability in policymaking, I will show you in a minute which parts does it entail. But we are looking at the legal basis. So what sets the norm? What are the rules? Then we are looking into conditions like openness of the government and access to information. And then we are looking into practices. And then there is also this part where we even look into impact, which is trust in government. And based on that, we are moving then into methods, because depending on the aspect that we are taking from this process, we use different kind of data. So then we have questionnaires to collect the data from governments, do review, validation process, and analyze. So integrity outlook is one of the products. So to show you all the parts of this principle 13 that are captured in the public integrity indicators. In dark blue, you see what I call this norm, setting the norm. So these are regulations for access to information, open data, public consultation, regulations for lobbying, conflict of interest, and political finance. And then we are looking at what is happening on the input side of the political system, what decisions are taken, but we are looking at the whole decision-making process. And the parts of it are these conditions would be access to information and openness, but then we are looking at the practice of having a consultation. So this is what I mentioned, not what not to do, but what should be done, so that citizens have the possibility to influence decision-making. Then we're looking at conflict of interest, political finance, lobbying, well, disclosure of data sets. This is a part of access to information. And then we are looking at draft laws and legislative process, which is then a different type of data that is collected. And in the end, you see 2 trust indicators, trust in government and trust in parliament. So just to show you an example how it looks like, you see here, this is the website with the indicators and the dashboard. Here you see the full overview of all the 17 parts I showed you before. And if we go into conflict of interest and safeguards in practice, so we are looking at the practices. You see here is the explanation, what do we mean under this? And here you will see the going into practice. So what does it mean in practice? Well, we would expect governments to have the submission rate of interest declaration from members of the government is 100% for the past 6 years. And here it goes on with different expectations, I would call it. In practice, when we collect data, we have for this conflict of interest part questions. So governments, they would receive these questions that correspond to what you see on the dashboard in the end. And here will be, please provide reference to specific provisions in the regulatory framework establishing, what is that? I think Cameron would be the better person to walk you through this. But this is just to show this operationalization process. How do we go from the concept?
More important is probably the next question. So this is just upload the regulation basically, and we analyze it, we send it back. and this is important here, that this is not like a self-reporting yes or no question. So do you have a list of incapabilities? Yes, and then we don't check it. No, we don't even ask that. We send us your regulations. We're going to check, and we're going to find the paragraph where you have the list of incapabilities, and then we're going to send it back for validation to you. So just in terms of process, for me, it's very important because it's very different to ask a person within government to say, do you have this, yes or no? And then maybe later validate it. It's much better to actually do the analysis yourself. So give me the primary source, give me your regulation that regulates this. And then we come back and say, yes, you did fulfill the criterion because of paragraph this. Or you didn't fulfill the criterion because paragraph 16 does not give a extensive list of positions that would lead to incompatibilities. And then later on, we ask for the actual data for submission. So if you scroll down the questionnaire, you will see where we ask for the numbers and for the full proof here. So this is where they put in the numbers, and then we always ask to provide the documentary evidence as well. So there are raw data files to supplement the numbers that they give here.
This is the part where I'm probably, as a qualitative researcher, most excited about, because in the process of analysis of all this, there are narratives about each aspect in each country. So there is a whole wealth of information where you can kind of work on sampling, on theory building, on different typologies.
Not look at the contracts.
Yes, I see Sophie has raised her hand. Sophie, please go ahead. You're muted. There you are.
I'm very intrigued. A quick question: how many people fill this in per country? Is this one questionnaire per country that is filled in by one person or by one group, or are several of these questionnaires sent out to various government agencies and then you compare and triangulate in a way?
So another big important difference to how we do things and how it's normally done. So if Oksana goes up to the top, so the questionnaire, because we want to go to the source, this is just an internal worksheet, and maybe we should not show too much of our internal cuisine. But if we go down a little bit, you will see that there are different sections of the questionnaire. And that is because if you really want this data, we could just rely on one focal point to answer, and then rely on them to do the internal coordination. The many international organizations, they do that. But if you want good data and you want fast data, then you make life a little bit easy. And we have different sections of the questionnaire which speak to the different institutions that hold the data. So we have one section for conflict of interest, another for lobbying, another for political finance. Because, for example, in some countries, the election commission wants to be the one that submits this data directly. They don't want to go through the Ministry of Interior, for example. So we can decentralize our data collection a lot, or we can centralize our data collection a lot. It's really a matter of the individual context. So to answer your question, Sophie, in some countries, indeed, maybe smaller countries, we will only have communication with one person or two people. In other large federal contexts, I think we've been up to 20. I've had Zoom calls for the kickoff meetings for large federal administrations with up to 20 different focal points, because the data was scattered all over the national administration. So that is a lot of work.
Yeah, so based on these elements, I will go then, no, Cameron will go into analysis process.
Sure. So yes, this is basically outlining what my job, what my day-to-day at the OECD consists of. But just to give you a sense of the steps that we go through to get the data from the countries, and then what ultimately gets published online on the data portal and goes into our publications. So we always start with the delegate from the working party, like Jesper mentioned. They're the ones who will nominate someone who they think will be the holder of the data that we need, depending on the thematic area. We hold an orientation meeting with them online. Sometimes it takes a few tries to identify the right person, but usually we get there. We then give them access to this questionnaire tool that Oksana was just showing you. And this is where they provide all of their information. And this is the starting point for us doing the analysis. But what's important to highlight, and what I'll show a bit later with some examples, is that we don't, speaking to the previous question, just take their word for granted. So we use the questionnaire as a tool that helps us more easily find the information that we need. But we do go through and fact check everything, which can be complicated, but we do it. And we always incorporate our own desk research as well, where countries might not be able to find data from their own administration, which is always a bit concerning, but we do help them sometimes with that. We always cross-review then within our team for internal consistency between at least 3 people to make sure that we're consistent across countries. And then once we've done that, we send our assessment to the country. And we like to stress when we communicate with them that we only want their comments on things that are factually incorrect. We don't want their thoughts on how the premise of the exercise is flawed, or how their country is a special case or something like that. We're really only interested in, okay, is the number of the law that we discussed here wrong? Is there another law that we didn't consider? Is there another report we should be looking at? So those kind of things, we go back and forth with them several rounds by email. Sometimes it's gone up to as many as 9 rounds of revisions with countries. But once they're satisfied that everything is factually correct, we click a button in our internal system that you just saw, and then it gets published via an API onto the portal. So that's the process that we go through. Takes varying amounts of time depending on the country, but that's what we do.
Okay, then I will show you a few slides from the Outlook, just to how, you know, all of this data. So we have around 16,000 data points now, but within the Outlook now, we've massaged some of the data to identify some also across the criteria. And this is where it takes a bit of time to learn how to also triangulate these things. So because now the indicators are split between de jure de facto, but they were always meant that in the final analysis, you would put them together. So some of the Outlook charts, they do that. So here we combine various different indicators and criteria into one analytical piece. So we look at these 4. So principle 13 of the recommendation is special. I forgot to mention that in the beginning, because it covers all the classic areas of anti-corruption, conflict of interest, lobbying, political finance, but it takes another kind of cut, and it says we only look at top officials. So we don't care about there are other principles that deal with classic civil servants, but for principle 13, we deal with the political layer, or that layer between the administration, so politically appointed, politically elected officials, and our democratic leaders. So in practice, when we crudely operationalize this into indicators, which positions do we look at? We look at ministers, members of government. We look at MPs, members of parliament. We look at the highest tier of civil servants, which is normally secretary generals. And we look at the highest tier of judges. And then we start going into, okay, regulations. Do they require that you disclose your private interests? And you can see here, the first column, that it's actually not universal. I think the closest you will get to universal is MPs. 97% of OECD countries do require MPs to disclose their interests, but for high-ranking judges, for example, it's only 58%. So already still, even though we like to say that the jury indicators have outlived their purpose, you need them in your measurement framework, and you do find areas for improvement even on the regulatory side. But of course, it gets even more important as you move into practice. And what we can do here is that we can look at, for a cross-country overview, we can look at how many actually monitor whether MPs, ministers, top-tier civil servants, and judges, how many countries actually have a monitoring mechanism to make sure that judges submit their interest declarations. In this case, it's 53% of countries. So 53% of the 58%, yeah? So if you have an obligation, do you actually have a supervision system to monitor whether interest declarations are being submitted? And this is with the realization that regulations are never self-implementable, that you always need to have a bit of a monitoring mechanism to make sure. Of the countries, the positive news is when you do have a monitoring mechanism in place, the actual submission rate, so how many judges submitted their interest declarations, is quite high. So you can see 100% for ministers, 100% for MPs, almost all top-tier civil servants. So when you have the systems in place, they work quite well. But it starts a few steps back. Many times we don't have the legal obligation, but much more importantly, no one is tasked with monitoring whether this actually happens in practice. So, you know, we have both the actual submission rate, where we count every single interest declaration that has been received by a judge, and Cameron will show you the tedious way of counting. And we have the jury step first, and we have the kind of the data availability, the monitoring step in between. If we go to the next slide, Cameron, you can kind of walk us through.
Yes, so we thought it would be helpful for this audience specifically if for each of these charts, we kind of show you a bit behind the scenes, what we actually do to come up with this data. So first, when we were talking here about interest declarations, we picked out some examples of countries that we think have nice portals to illustrate the situation. Sometimes it is a bit more complicated because the country doesn't have a nice portal. But in the case of France, they do have quite a good portal for searching interest declarations of top officials. So we would go through each of these categories that Jesper just mentioned. We have an Excel sheet, we find, okay, we're looking at ministers over the past 6 years. Who is every minister that there was in France in the past 6 years? We go through, we search their interest declarations, we check that they're there. Same for MPs, same for high-ranking judges, the top tier civil servants. Of course, some of those categories of officials have more people in them. I mean, in some countries, when you're talking about the parliament, you're talking about quite a large number of MPs. So we are also trying to increasingly employ web scraping and other techniques to speed up the process a bit more. But again, just to demonstrate that we go through and we do check that the data the government has provided via the questionnaire is correct.
So another example is lobby registers, which is one of the classic tools in the lobby area. And we in the Outlook, we have this chart, which is a basic kind of description of which countries have a lobby register, first and foremost. And for those countries that have a lobby register, which different functionalities does it include? And more importantly, what type of information does it include? Is it a very basic one where you can only find the name of the lobbyist, or do they go into more depth and provide you with the type of lobbying? Very importantly, the legislation targeted and information about budget and expenses. There are more categories here and that you could add, but I think these 4 are very important basic preconditions for a good functioning lobby register. And in practice, it's not easy, but I mean, you can check it, right? So if you have a lobby register, Cameron will go, not for all countries. We have a big team, but
yes,
you're in charge of around 10 to 15 countries.
Exactly. So here, to provide another example, this is the lobby register in Ireland. This is a bit more straightforward than these ones that involve calculating rates, like the interest declarations. But for all of these tools, we do similar things with, for example, the business registry, the land registry. We go on the tool, we check that it has all of these features that we look for. So especially important things would be like the domain of intervention, the legislation targeted, the budget or expenses spent by the lobbyist. And we will search some big companies in the country or big lobbying organizations, go through and check that each of those features are there. A big thing we look through also is if the data can be searched and filtered, because of course that makes it a lot easier to check and meaningfully work with the information that's disclosed.
And again, a byproduct of our work is that we often also kind of informally give advice to countries on, there are often some quite easy upgrades to the lobby registers that would make a lot of sense for the general public. And by now, Cameron is an expert in what is a user-friendly lobby register, because he's been through quite a lot of them. So this is a pro bono activity from the Public Integrity Indicators team. Joseph, go ahead.
Thank you. Sorry, I had a question about previous slide. I guess I don't know if the discussion about lobbying still applies to the next one though. But I was wondering because so the indicator that you just showed us is related to the public accessibility of lobby registries, right? But I was wondering about the monitoring of lobbying activities or interest representation activities. Because as we know, in some countries, of course, interest representation continues to take place, but the law requiring them to register is just bypassed with individuals and groups just not registering. Is that something that is also measured? How does your team addresses the issue of monitoring the comprehensiveness of these registries?
It's a very good question. So far we don't have an easy measure of the data quality within the register. It's a bit like Cameron said, on a kind of on a basis of us going through the most important companies, making sure that they're there, but not down to the last company within the country.
And maybe just to add, I mean, we do have one criterion which is not displayed anywhere in this chart, but about if there is at least an institution responsible for monitoring. So that is incorporated.
Okay, thank you. No, that I mean, I guess it was a bit of an unfair question because indeed I was even trying to remember if I have ever encountered a measurement or a way to assess the extent to which a country is able to show that indeed they have all the lobbying organization registered. I couldn't come up with from the top of my head. So no, I completely agree that it is a particularly difficult thing to assess.
I don't think it's impossible. It's also it's about like and within all databases, you know, you want to make sure that you have what's the word? I forgot the word. But it's a classic feature of measuring the quality of a public register, whether you have a lot of empty spaces, whether it's comprehensive. And actually the lobby indicators for now are very basic because the existing recommendation, again, we have to kind of follow the norms, and lobbying is one of the newest areas, policy areas within the anti-corruption movement in general. So they're quite basic. With the new 2024 lobbying recommendation, we have this good illustration of how the process works. Because we have a new lobbying recommendation, which is a bit more ambitious, we also have a new mandate in the future to increase, let's say, the level of ambition of the indicators. So this is a job for us in the autumn. It's to start working within the task force of saying, okay, what additional criteria could we add to this? So we're probably going to keep the existing ones, but we might think about adding a few extra ones. Okay, then one more example on this case in the area of political finance. Again, combining, and this would be great. It's also a way to that from the people in this room. This is really how the indicators are meant to work. And if you help you navigate a little bit when you download the data, that you can do the same. So you can combine for most of them. In this case, is there a legal requirement for political parties to disclose their financial reports and their election campaign reports on the one hand? That's the inner circle regulations, and you can see that most countries, 79% in the case of annual financial reports, they do have that legal requirement. But then the outer circle measures whether all political parties that is represented in parliament, whether they actually in practice disclosed their annual reports. And you can see that it's not all of them. So it's about half that actually followed their own national legislation. And then, of course, it begs the question, which parties did not disclose, etc., in what countries. That level of detail is something we have in our database, but it's not something that we publish. But it will help you as a kind of indication already that for country X, we see an implementation gap. And then it's up for other actors to follow up on what are these. But all of this information is available from the Election Commission, and all it takes is for someone to take it and standardize it across countries and publish it. And then you have a few particular cases where you have, and this is also the good thing about operating with de jure de facto, where you actually have no legal requirement, but you do see that all political parties do publish. So I think this is a little bit of an odd edge case, but it's important to give credits to these, particularly in the OECD context, which is, you know, mature, advanced economies, where sometimes you don't need the legal requirement as long as you have the practice actually happen. And again, this is perfectly verifiable, checkable.
Yes, exactly. So here's just an example of the database in Lithuania that we relied on. Maybe a few important things that I'll just highlight that Jesper already mentioned. One is that the criterion focuses specifically on whether the parties submit their reports on time. So this example from Lithuania, I think, shows really well. They track this very clearly when the reports were actually submitted and whether they met the deadlines outlined in national legislation. And then the other point is this one about focusing on parties represented in parliament, because that was actually missing. So originally we were planning to look at all political parties. What we realized when we started collecting the data from the first few countries is that it was very often the case that there would be one or two very small parties with like 100 members that didn't submit the report on time, and that was originally causing them to not fulfill the criterion. So we took a step back and fine-tuned it a bit, because we like to think about, you know, what is the risk behind this, and the risk to political integrity if a small party of 100 people doesn't submit the report on time is probably not very high. But the risk if one of the biggest parties doesn't submit the report on time is quite high. So that's also a bit of how we try to make sure that we're still being reasonable with what we ask countries to do.
And even with this more reasonable level,
yes,
the implementation gap is still quite big.
Yeah.
So. Okay, and then I think a bit we have two more examples, and now we're moving up to the bit more advanced and frontier type of measures, which admittedly we also have our own data gaps. So this is getting more and more difficult to get the data, and particularly for this one. This is about revolving doors. So this is about pre and post conflict. Pre and post. I used to work in post-conflict and fragile states, as Sophie knows. No, this is about pre and post-employment regulations And particularly, we only look at, there's some legends missing here, but what we track is the inner circle or ministers, and the outer circle is secretary generals, and whether they have been employed within the area that they formally regulated. So for example, for a lobby organization, for an interest organization, within 2 years of leaving their office. So this is a quite heavy one in terms of tracking. It's not a new idea. Actually, when I was at U4, one of the good submissions to the proxy challenge was exactly about this, about revolving doors and tracking revolving doors. Here we have a quite narrow focus. So it's the most important in our framework for political integrity, most important positions, ministers and secretary generals. But of course, you could do it in any sector, the financial sector. You could go into various, let's say, variants of this. And we do have the actual rates, but for the outlook, we focused on the top level message, which was about, do we just have the data on whether this is actually tracked within countries? And we can see that, well, a few countries track, but most countries do not. And in many cases, we don't know. That's the gray box. So, and of course, I think our policy message here is that it's not, of course, it's not a criminal offense. In some countries, you have specific rules on this. In some countries, you don't. But whatever the rules are, it's typically a red flag. If you see a lot of pantouflage, if you see a lot of revolving doors within a particular area, at least then you just have to be aware that you need very good safeguards in terms of pre-post employment regulations to make sure that no undue influence is happening.
Jesper, a quick question about this. Tracking, so countries tracking this movement of their office holders, does that also involve making that information accessible to the public?
I think that's another step. So if we go into the next slide, sometimes it's publicly available. Most of the time we can find that. But we also have, if we can get the information directly from the governments, we would, and if we're able to verify it, we don't make it a criterion that it's publicly available. But,
yep. So yeah, I mean, on that note, this is definitely one of the trickier ones to verify and collect the data on. We have a few different ways we go about it depending on the country. So in some cases, like here you have the example from the UK, and there it's actually, so if you're leaving public office, you actually need to get an opinion from this body called the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments about your post-public employment activities. So here it's a lot easier to check the data because since every person who's leaving needs to get an opinion, you can go through, you can check from the opinions where they're going. And this is something that we do in a similar way to the conflict of interest declarations. We'll go through every minister from, I think we look at the last 5 years, and go about it like that. In some countries, they do sort of track the data, but they don't have this. So actually on our questionnaire, we have certain pieces where we ask the country to send the questionnaire to every ministry in the country, because it's possible that within the Ministry of Interior, they might know where their own former officials went, but there's no central government body collecting data on this. And this is, of course, a very heavy exercise for countries because it takes a lot of effort to get a response from every ministry in the country, especially in some countries that have like 25 ministries. And it's also difficult to make sure that the different ministries understand the questions in the same way and provide consistent responses with each other. But we do have some countries where we've gotten the data that way. And so that's, then we kind of have to check all of the information we receive from each ministry in a more ad hoc manner.
and that is very basic. So that is looking at ministers' CVs, looking at appointment newsletters coming out of the business association. But because it's not that many and Cameron doesn't have a social life anyway, so he's very happy to go through all of these individual statements. Okay, last example, and then we'll open up. This is what we call legislative data. So it's basically data directly from parliaments. It's usually the public relations office of the parliament, where we dig down into that data set. And the two indicators that we've included in our framework are: one is the frequency of laws adopted through extraordinary procedure, as an indication of many important things. One relates to integrity, but of course it's also about legal certainty. It's about better regulation. So as you move up the result chain, you know, things become a bit more blurred in terms of the boundaries of anti-corruption and just good government as usual. Nevertheless, it's a very good KPI in general for parliaments. And the other one is the frequency of how often you change, how often you amend laws. It relates a lot to also how interest representation and lobbying and how easy it is for citizens to follow parliamentary activities and actually have a normal voice and follow the legislative changes, or whether you need to be a top professional lobby company to influence parliament activities. And you can see here that if we go back one more time, just to put, this is a data set that we're really investing a lot into now. So we're building a time series across. And of course, for example, during COVID times, we saw a big increase in the number of laws that was adopted through extraordinary procedure. So emergency laws adopted to deal with COVID. So this is a very good indicator because it's not sticky, yeah. So it really depends on the government formation at the time. It really depends on external shocks, and it's actionable. So you get a new government in, you can very quickly change your habits. You can very quickly kind of reduce the number of external of emergency laws. You can reduce the tempo of legislative changes. So it's actually possible to have a good process where interest representations can do good lobbying and not bad lobbying. But these numbers here, I think, are interesting to go through. Again, this is 2022, 2021 data. So this was in COVID times, and you can see in Greece, for example, there was a very high number of emergency laws adopted. It was in the same time as everyone was dealing with the COVID crisis, and you can see in other countries you did not have so big swings on this indicator. So I think we're going to do a lot more work on this, and we're not the only ones working on this. Mihaly Fasikas has been doing a lot of work text mining these legislative databases. I think the tricky part is not that. The tricky part is actually understanding what counts as an extraordinary procedure in different countries. And here, honestly, it is a plus to work very closely with government officials that can also explain to us what procedure should we be looking at. Because whether you have a bicameral system, whether you have a presidential system, the interpretation of this data will matter a lot. So it's still raw data that needs to be interpreted with care. Nevertheless, I think really interesting data and actionable data for governments. And Cameron, how do we do it?
Yes, so for the last time, this is one example from Slovakia of, this is actually not so common, but I think it's a good example of a parliament that actually publishes a dedicated list of laws that were approved in an extraordinary or emergency procedure. In many other countries, we need to exert a lot more effort and look at, maybe they just tag the laws that they pass in a specific way, that they went through a certain procedure or something like that. But our methodology is that for all countries that have some kind of extraordinary or emergency procedure in their parliamentary proceedings, we take that data, and then in the few countries that do not have such a procedure, we look at the laws, the percentage of laws that were adopted within 10 days or fewer, so that we kind of have some way to still involve these countries in the data set. Of course, it's a bit crude and we're hoping to refine it a bit further. And one thing we're also hoping to specify a bit more as we put more information out about our methodology is that we do exclude from our calculations certain laws that it might make sense that they're adopted in a very fast-tracked way and it's not necessarily an integrity risk. So something like a ratification of an international treaty or transposition of EU legislation when it's just a matter of taking the regulation adopted by the EU and putting it directly into your national legislation. Presumably, there's already been some scrutiny at another level, the same in the case of a treaty. So that's also something that we can always provide more information on. But I think the one thing I would really highlight, like Jesper said, is we are now building a time series, and we've looked in several countries at these very clear examples where you put a line on the date that the government changed, and suddenly you see either a huge rise or a huge drop in the use of emergency procedures. And I think there's a lot of room for academics and other people to go in and analyze these findings in more detail.
Okay, so you should definitely go to the portal. But in this community, you need to go further. You need to go to the Data Explorer, which is where you download the data set. And you've already looked at the Outlook, but you should send it to all your best friends so that they can also benefit from this publication. And if you haven't, go and check out the front page, because it's again where we try to, having worked on these data sets, this is where we show the pre-cooked data, where we try and take some of the de facto indicators and put them together in the way that they're meant to be analyzed. So we have a few minutes left, but we also took questions as we moved along.
Yes, thank you, Jesper. No, I love when the end of the presentation file can pretty much coincide with the last few minutes of the roundtable. But by all means, if anybody have any question, already I see Katerina. Please go ahead, and then Sophie.
Hi, I'm Katerina Boguslavska from the Basel Institute on Governance. I'm doing the Basel Anti-Money Laundering Index. And I have a question to Jesper. You mentioned in the beginning that at some point you are getting the answer from governments that this is not applicable, the standard is not applicable to the country. So-called non-applicable data. Did you try to interpret that? Do you see any trends on which questions countries most likely to answer that this is not applicable? I'm asking because when you work with FATF data on money laundering, there is a specific recommendation where you have not applicable data, while for all others, the data is applicable. So did you try to unpack this?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So we had a rule when we designed our indicators. We had like a few basic rules when we worked with the countries in the beginning about what type of indicators these should be, and they reflect a little bit the presentation. They should be a dashboard. They shouldn't be a high-level composite. They should draw on primary data. And then also, and we said that if we want really good indicators, we need to actually tap into your primary data. So it'll be more work for you, but you will get better indicators back. And this was also one of the key components that we said we will not have not applicable criteria. So we do the pre-work now to make sure that we always have that there are no opt-outs, because typically the opt-outs are those that don't do well in the data set. Those that do well, they always want their data to be shown. So that was just very useful to have done the pre-work to say, well, no, talk now or forever hold your peace, because when we move into this, we will have to find a solution. And then the indicators, this is the craft of creating good criteria, is that they are universal as far as at least the OECD space. I mean, now we're moving to expand beyond the OECD. So we've sent an invitation to 30 non-members. So they still travel well, but I guess the more you add, the more difficult this becomes, but they still travel well across different geographies. And I just know from previous work that this is I think the English expression is this, the thin end of the wedge. Once you start making exceptions for one or two countries, everyone wants to be treated as an exception. So the cases are like, yeah, that we have a very special situation where we have a new government, or we have a special type of presidential system. But in most cases, it does work in the end.
Okay.
But in most cases, it's about the explanation behind. So as I said, for example, with legislative data, as we move forward, we will be better at maybe publishing some policy papers to also explain all of these choices behind. And it's more about that the rate for country X is not applicable, but yes, it's a presidential system. So you need to be aware of that when you look at the rate. And then maybe you need to look at another indicator next to it, which is around emergency presidential decrees, which is actually where the problem is, and it's not in parliament. And these are just nuances, very important contextual information that. So for me, it's not that this indicator is not applicable, but to really understand this indicator, you need to, as always, you have to dig deeper. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sophie?
Yes, so I feel like maybe I should already know this, but how dynamic is this data? So if there are changes, can countries request that their data is being adapted, updated, or are you going to do this for all countries at the same time? That's my first question. My second question is, based on what you showed, I saw that Belgium, Germany, New Zealand, which I believe are all long-term OECD members, are notably absent, not providing data. Why? And what can you do about it?
Those are big questions with 0 minutes left, Sophie, but they're very good questions. So again, because we are not taking any shortcuts and we're not just pushing out a value for a country based on what an expert thinks or something like that, we will have data gaps. So we will have countries where we don't have data from, because if we don't have that primary input from the country, and if we don't have that validation round with the country, we will not publish it. It's getting less and less. So as you saw now, it's only a handful of countries where we don't have that data. And trust me, we're working very hard and actively to re-engage. And actually with all of these countries, after the outlook was published, we've resumed the dialogue, and I'm confident. So the positive indications for all of them, for all of the countries that you mentioned. The outlook was the first inaugural one, and I think by 2026, these countries are very committed to being fully represented. So that's on those, and then this is also part of their obligations as part of being signatories to the recommendation, etc. So, but these things take a bit of time. In terms of do we retrospectively correct values, we've had a few cases. Again, so no one is perfect, and I think it's better to correct a value than to leave it factually inaccurate. So it's often, it's not about kind of malfeasance or anything. It's about also sometimes capacity within the administration, and even sometimes Cameron makes a mistake. God bless. That we've also learned, for example, that even in the cases where countries say no, we don't have this. Those are actually the ones where we would trust that countries want to look good. And so far, in the beginning, we only checked the yeses. So we would only verify if a country said they have it. But actually, most of those where we had to correct is that where the country said, no, we don't have that. And then we would have the outlook go through another committee, and another government official would say, actually, we do have that. So of course, no one is perfect. And then we have to correct that value that yes, in country X, we do have an obligation for MPs to disclose their interests. So yeah, we are retrospectively making a few changes in the data set. So it is quite live, particularly some of them, like the strategy data set. It updates quite regularly as the strategy cycle of countries they progress, and they're on different schedules. You have to update them. I think the data on regulations are quite stable generally, whereas some of the other numerical rates, for some of them, we're working on time series, as we heard. So it's quite live data set. So that means, we have the 2-year cycle now, which is good, with the outlook, where we will update. We will also update this data set for the next outlook. We will take a general sweep of all countries. But in between, we also update, like, for example, Finland just had a new lobby register. And we then updated the data set to be up to date with this new development. So it's a bit of both.
Maybe can I just add something really quickly? I know we're also out of time, but I just think it's important to distinguish between, we do still maintain a reference year for each data set. So this one we talked about today that came out in 2022, there's a difference between if a country points out an error that was already the case in 2022, then we just fix it directly. But if it's a matter of a new law or something that was adopted, we do keep track of that in our database as a separate reference year. And then if it comes to a publication like the Outlook, we'll always display the most recent reference year that we have. But we do still, for an eventual time series, keep track of what was the case in 2022, what was the case in 2023, so that we can build that out as we go along.
Great. Thank you, Jesper, Oksana, Cameron, for a wonderful presentation. It was lovely having you here for a second time, which is a natural result of the great work that your office is conducting. So as long as you continue this level of quality, I will hope that you will accept another invitation next time that there's some new data to share with us. I really appreciate it, and I think that I can speak on behalf of everyone else here with us that we have learned a lot from the work of your office, and good luck with everything else. And yeah, that's pretty much it for today. Thank you for being so generous with your time, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Stay tuned for the next for the information about the next roundtable. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph.